Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our webinar coordinated by Scientist.com and FingerPost on market access, transforming biotech commercial decisions. Our first co-sponsor today is Scientist.com, the world's largest marketplace for the sourcing of scientific services. Scientist.com's goal is to remove the administrative burdens from accessing suppliers to speed up your research, progress pipelines, and enable success. We do this proactively by addressing all the legal, finance, and due diligence requirements so that your organization can identify and contract directly with suppliers of market access and other areas as quickly as possible. It's why we now support 27 of the top 30 biopharma, plus over 100 small to medium biotechs in accessing over 5,000 suppliers, including 400 just in the market access health economics space. Our marketplace not only saves money, but can also get a project started in as little as 2 days under industry developed and approved legal agreements. But with that, I'd like to now introduce our co-sponsor today, FingerPost, and I have the pleasure of introducing their CEO, Kath Bacon.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks to Scientist.com for helping to organise and host this webinar. At FingerPost, we are a consulting group who are passionate about supporting biotech and pharmaceutical companies with fit-for-purpose market access and pricing solutions. Our solutions support early commercial decisions from phase 1 onwards, with the majority of our work focused on building asset value prior to the pivotal or registrational trials. It's actually through the work we do on the buy side and the commercialization of assets that we've seen the issues caused when early commercial decisions haven't taken market access and pricing into account. I won't dwell on these now because, like you, I want to hear from our excellent panel of experts who've kindly agreed to talk on this subject today. If you would like to hear a little bit more, find out a bit more information about FingerPost, please do download our handout and contact me with any questions. I'll now hand it over to Mel Walker to introduce himself, why he believes market access is an important consideration for smaller biotech companies, and to explore this further with our panelists.
Hi there, a very warm welcome to wherever you're dialing in from. It's great to see so many people dialing in from many different markets around the world. I wanted to say a very big thank you to Scientist.com and FingerPost for organising this panel on this topic. It's a very important topic, one that's close to my heart and I'm passionate about too. And I do believe that if we can really address the issue of access during early commercial decision making, particularly in small biotech where much of our innovation now comes from in the industry, then we will actually increase the amount of innovation ultimately reaching patients, which I think is why many of us are in the pharma and biotech sector in the first place. I realised how important this topic was when I was in my first broader commercial role. I was asked to build and lead a business development team for Europe. A couple of years previously, I joined the global decision-making board for business development for a mid-cap pharma company. And so this really gave me a significant awareness of how BD decisions were being made and how larger companies really assessed and evaluated the value propositions that were coming from smaller companies. Ultimately, the CEO's decision to appoint me to these roles was actually driven because of my prior experience of building and leading access teams at a global and European level, because he realised and the business realised that the payer was now the dominant stakeholder in all of our major markets. And so that means, of course, that market access considerations were of fundamental importance to commercialisation and therefore of fundamental importance for the evaluations and assessments of new assets by larger companies. As those of you working in BD will be very aware that actually the BD process has a big funnel. There's a lot of companies at the top of that funnel and a lot of evaluations to be done before you reach the 1 or 2 deals that actually end up getting made. And so we reviewed many companies, many assets and value propositions. And the sad truth of it was that actually many of the smaller biotechs did not have a good understanding of market access. And this was really impacting their ability to make deals and the nature of those deals. And we could really see that by the sort of volume of companies that we were reviewing. I just want to spend a couple of moments just giving maybe a few of the consequences of that gap in understanding before we sort of go on to introducing the panel. I think the potential disadvantages are, the doomsday scenario is that there's no deal possible. And that's simply because if you haven't addressed the payer considerations globally, then maybe you don't have an asset that's commercially viable, despite how impressive you think the clinical sort of aspects of that product are. Number two, and this is a far more common one, I think, which we saw a lot, was the deal is possible, but money is being left on the table. So the market requirements for some geographies or markets have not been addressed, and therefore that leads to some geographies being excluded or the revenue stream from those markets being heavily discounted. A very common example of this was Europe. Often Europe couldn't be part of the deal because there was a commercially non-viable sort of launch approach for that region. I think there's also an issue, obviously, as a small biotech, you want lots of potential partners or acquiring companies being in the process. You want to create competitive tension. Now, of course, only some companies are willing to address a gap in payer evidence and also cope with the delay in commercial return that comes from addressing those gaps. So I think in some ways you're sort of limiting your pool of potential partners if you don't address these considerations early. And last but not least, I think the sort of strength of your negotiation power when it comes to deal making is significantly reduced if you don't really have a handle on these things. And that's because larger pharma companies, of course, have lots and lots of access capability. They really understand how important it is. They are dialing down heavily on these aspects because they know about its criticality for launch and commercialization, and therefore they need to understand this up front. So if you don't understand the path to addressing the payer requirements, then you're going to be disadvantaged when it comes to negotiation. So that's all I'm going to say to sort of kick off. I hope that's a sort of way of sort of setting the scene for this panel. I'm really grateful for the panelists we had today because you will see that their breadth and depth of experience will add a huge amount to this topic, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'd like to kick off. You've got the panelists up here in front by doing a quick round of introductions. If we could go in a clockwise direction, starting with you and going round. If you could introduce yourself, your current role, any prior roles that are relevant, and also cover any necessary disclaimers. I just draw the audience attention to the disclaimer here. The views of the panelists are their own. This is being videoed, and so often this needs to be made clear up front. So if I could start with you.
Yeah, pleasure, and thanks for inviting me to this important panel. Joep Myers, I'm with Gilde Healthcare. Gilde is a firm that invests in healthcare, life sciences exclusively, Europe, US, therapeutics, devices, health tech. We're one of the larger players in Europe. My personal background, I've been with Gilde for a while. Before that, I was operational with a company called PureTech in Boston. Before that, I was with another investor, LSP, now part of EQT. Before that, I was in healthcare banking, and before that, I did my PhD in molecular biology. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you. Sadi?
Hey, thanks, Mel, for inviting, and it's great to be here. I'm Sandeep Duragut. I'm the Vice President and Head of Global Pricing and Market Access at a commercial stage biotech called Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. I've been here since 2022. Prior to that, I had a long stint at a big pharma called Pfizer, and followed by about 7 or 8 years in pricing and market access consulting, where I have built the global pricing and access practices in two, both boutique and as well as more recognized consulting companies. So glad to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sandeep. Hilary?
And I've got about 25 years of experience in a range of mid to large pharma and biotech. Also got a bit of consulting experience and across quite a broad range of therapy areas. Most particularly, I've been a country general manager, so responsible for the entirety of Gilead's business in the UK and Ireland. I spent some time in the US, used to lead Gilead's HIV business in the US. So I know that market in some depth, and I now look after market access, value and access across Gilead's portfolio and across the globe.
Thank you, Hilary. Sahil?
Sure. Hi, Mel, and hi, everyone. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I'm a physician by training, and since then, for the last 17 plus years now, I've been working in drug development in sort of various settings, large and small pharma, biotech, as well as some consulting work over the years. I currently serve as the Chief Business Officer with a company called Atai Life Sciences. It's a NASDAQ-listed biotech, which sort of has a model where we invest in companies taking on minority or majority stakes, but also have an in-house pipeline, which we continue to actively develop and grow. I mean, just on that, the focus, my focus in my current role has an investment mandate, capital allocation across the subsidiaries, but also early commercial planning for our assets to think on how these could actually be successful in the marketplace and to get further investment. I've in the past worked in roles which includes launching 2 drugs, both from market access perspective as well as having led early pipeline functions and developed global processes to ensure that the right value creation plans are in place. So yeah, looking forward to bringing those perspectives in.
And thank you, Sahil, and thank you to all of you again for joining the panel. I think the audience will see that we've got a lot of experience here at the table today, so I really appreciate that. I'm going to ask a few questions of the panel first of all. We will come to some questions from the audience later, so please do put your questions into the question box. If the questions don't get answered today, I've been assured that people from Scientist.com or from FingerPost will address all questions as a follow-up, so you will get a response. So yeah, we will only be able to cover a handful today, but I think that will be fine. Mike, I'm going to just address the first question, but then there's going to be a pre-question that I'm going to ask just to sort of set the scene a little bit. The first question is going to be around the fact that when I talk to small biotech, they often say, look, we're not going to commercialize this asset. We don't need to worry about market access because this is going to be picked up by a future partner, an acquiring company. They will do all of this work for us. So why should we bother about market access? So the question I'm going to ask is, why is it critical to smaller biotech, and why should they bother in those circumstances, which is obviously a very common circumstance? But before I come to that question, I'm actually going to ask Hilary and Sandeep to really cover a short sort of description of what market access is, very simply, and why it's so critical. The reason is we've got, out of the audience, we've got some people who are very experienced in access. We've also got some people that are very much at the baseline. I want to get everyone at least on the same page of what we're talking about before we kick into the discussion. So can I start with you, Hilary, and then go to Sandeep?
It takes you from regulatory approval through to the idea that a prescriber can freely choose to prescribe your product. Now, that might look like a national reimbursement process in a country like France or Germany, where you're required to submit a dossier with evidence and then go through a negotiation to get listed. It might look like listing with a particular payer in the US and the agreement of price and contracting there. Or it might be other economic barriers that come into play. This is especially important in the US, where you might find that a new technology, CAR-T would be an example of this, changes financial flows between different types of provider, and that can create incentives or disincentives. So I would say anything that sits between, we have a product on the market and somebody who has a desire to prescribe it can prescribe it. That's the totality of what market access is to me. So,
just chiming on that, I think from a manufacturer standpoint, market access is a last mile connectivity between the regulatory approval. I mean, let's just say about the label, and finding making sure that the product is available to every eligible patient possible. And whatever the manufacturer can do, and that is becoming the last mile connectivity, maybe sometimes the most important mile prior to the formal commercialization, i.e. prescriptions being written and patients getting the drug.
I like that. I mean, it's almost like the sort of difference between market access and patient access. And people are sometimes using the term patient access because because it's the sort of mission of the company. Everyone needs to do a part of that to get it into the hands of patients. So then thank you for answering that pre-question. But now the first question: why should biotech bother with access if they're not self-commercializing? I'd like to open this up to the whole panel. I don't know who sort of wants to kick off with that.
I can give you the investor perspective, Mel, which is very simple, at least for us. Imagine asking that question in any other sector. Like, I have something, I'm developing it, but I have no idea who will use it and if anyone is willing to pay for it. Would you not think, what the heck, right? So for us, if you don't want to do it, it's fine. Just do not come see us. Our adagium is a better care at lower cost. So we make clear assessments of the cost implications as early as you are. We just do that by thinking of what could this become, like a target product profile, as that is called. And then with that profile, how would it be used? What would you need to do to make sure, indeed, like the two prior panelists explained so well. And if you're not willing to at least consider that at an early enough stage, and this is crucial, at an early enough stage, so that when you now develop it, you can take these lessons into consideration and not get surprised in the end by having, for example, an irrelevant product that nobody wants to pay for, that doesn't fit into the clinical flow, that no doctor is willing to use, So yeah, we're pretty adamant about this, Mel. It's quite important for us.
Thank you.
Just building on that, I think excellent points there. One thing I would definitely, the lens I would apply is ultimately this is about demonstrating value. And yes, you can demonstrate value to regulators through clinical endpoints, but then what about value to other stakeholders? And because the clinical development process is effectively an incremental de-risking process, when you think of it from an investment lens or even a value creation lens, it's important that you set that on the right trajectory for all arguments that you want to build. Because if you're trying to build a new argument further down in the process and you haven't de-risked that and you haven't flipped those cards along the way, it's highly unlikely you will be able to make that argument later on and show that additional value point, and you completely lose that ability to take that risk at a later stage. And it's a matter of balancing risk, and you at an early stage is where you are able to take those riskier steps.
Thank you. And Hilary, I thought you're obviously a company that's acquiring these assets. What are your thoughts?
On a range of different acquisitions that we've then integrated, and my team will look at every business development deal that we consider and weigh into that evaluation. So I think the misnomer comes here because you have a sequential process. People think that you might need to think about it sequentially. So just because your access process may come after your regulatory process doesn't mean that you don't need to think about your access process until the regulatory process finishes. Any more than, when you design your clinical trials, you're designing them with a regulatory process in mind. Of course you are. So my advice would be to consider access as just as fundamental as your regulatory processes. And when you think about the total revenues that your offering represents, it's a very simple equation of volume times price. So market access weighs in actually to both of those, weighs in critically on the price, the value that you can ascribe, and sometimes that's set for you by a government payer. And it weighs into the access piece, because the first filter that you think about when you think about the uptake of your product is whether or not a payer is actually going to be paying for that, and whether that's going to be accessible to physicians and patients.
Yeah, absolutely. It just reminds me that about 10 years ago, the European regulators, maybe longer, started to engage with payers and HTA to collaborate on joint scientific advice. And it was very clear, obviously, to the larger companies that actually if that was going on and the regulators cared about what the payers are doing, then they better also care. But I think sometimes I sort of feel the smaller biotech don't have this sort of advantage of those capabilities and being aware of some of these things, because they're obviously smaller, more cost constrained organizations. Sandeep, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, now in the in a commercial stage biotech, and it's public knowledge, we are not profitable yet, expected to be reach profitability in 2025. So I think the other element is the valuation of the company, whether it's a single molecule or multi-asset. I think the value and more this concept of value creation is being seen through even the lens of the initial coverage by the analyst. I mean, you'd be surprised. I mean, now even at JP Morgan, where everyone is looking for deals, the questions are coming more often as, will someone actually pay for this product when it comes to the market, whether it's 5 years from now or even 10 years from now, depending on the technology. So the thinking of analysts, investor analysts, or the investor community as your key opinion leaders is becoming more and more critical in this value chain that probably didn't exist, I would say, even 5 or 7 years back. And the circle of the information that is being shared and evaluated is almost like analysts going to the clinical KOLs, or even the investigators, to ask them what is the potential from a from a prescribing standpoint. And at the same time, the same analysts are going also to the payer stakeholders and asking, will United Healthcare or HAS in France, how are they going to warm up to this target product profile? And those feedback are coming back to the the corporation, privately or publicly held. And now we are reflecting, as well as the executive leadership is reflecting on those information, not just being talked and discussed within the company, but their primary external stakeholders are asking them the same questions. And we faced a very, very similar situation in our last earnings call, and it's in public domain, so I'm not sharing anything proprietary. We showcased our phase 3 trial data, and all the questions pivoted to the pricing and access, including the upcoming ICER evaluation of this therapeutic class. That's how much detail they went. No one was asking about your design or the comparative positioning vis-a-vis the other players in the marketplace. The first question was on pricing and access, followed by a question about ICER evaluation. So when I think the executive leaders of a small or a large biotech, doesn't matter, when they face the questions about pricing and access, there is an automatic impetus inside the organization to come to the table with the information that they need to answer those questions in the public setting.
Yeah.
Excellent. Sorry, Hilary, you're going to come in with something else. I could see you about to.
I think some of this has come because of some of the shifts that we've seen in the US in particular in recent years. So I think for a long time, it felt like market access was something you really had to think about ex-US, and particularly in Europe. Not to say that you weren't doing it within the US, but it was a lot easier. There was a lot less of that pressure for really structured evaluations. What's changed in the US is with the Inflation Reduction Act and with the CMS negotiations at the back end of the product life cycle, that makes a huge difference to how you value a product. And so if anybody was not thinking about evidence generation or value generation, that's brought it into very, very clear, sharp focus. And I think that's where you see this becoming a more natural language for analysts. When it happens in the US, you can't ignore it. The other thing that's going on in the US is you hear the sort of federal level, the national level things are very well known about, but there's also an increasing level of pricing pressure at a state level in the US. So things like state drug affordability boards, this is a whole new concept that at any stage in a product life cycle, somebody's going to come in and start saying you cannot price your drug above this level, or we're going to have a negotiation and it's going to result in us setting a price for your medicine. So this is totally new for the US, and I think that's what's made this sort of even sharper focus for those people where it wasn't.
Thank you. I think that's so. I just want to make one point here. I think it's always been a case. Value creation is the same in Europe and US. But the interesting thing is that US hasn't been a demander of the evidence that European payers might have been asking for. But if you go to when I was working global payer roles, I would often ask the US to reforecast based on the additional evidence that was being requested in Europe. And although they hadn't asked for it, the forecast always went significantly north of the original forecast. And so, the value creation that you're delivering by generating more evidence is significant in the US too. So, Hill, you were going to come in with a point.
Yeah. I think just giving a very specific example on how that's evolved and evolving in the last 5 to 7 years. So, just moving. If you think of an example in psychiatry. For the last 7 or 8 years, there's been significant shifts in where prescribers sit and how much leeway they have on what they're prescribing in the US. So about maybe 10 years ago, there's data which shows that up to 80% of psychiatrists were in the community and had freedom to prescribe. And the shift has been that less than 20% are in that place right now, which basically means the classic share of voice model commercial push post-launch, even in a high volume space like psychiatry, is no longer viable. And you're having vertically integrated teams, commercial teams, which have an access person there having value arguments right from the top of that pyramid and pushing down structures within which prescribers are having to operate. So it's at every level. And even field commercial planning, it's becoming highly integral in the US now.
Thank you. I think we've already done a good job in a short space of time of actually demonstrating how important access is. So thank you for all those perspectives. And it's important globally, clearly, not just in certain jurisdictions. I wanted to switch gear a little bit and sort of ask the question about how sort of market access considerations are being built into asset assessments, both by companies and investors, and how it impacts potentially on deal size and structure. And I'd like to start with Joop here. And I know Joop, and I'm sort of not taking some of your storm here, but the work you've done in sort of creating a board which really pressure tests some of this stuff, and how do you sort of build that in? Because I do think you're definitely one of the sort of more progressive investors in how you're addressing these issues.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that, Mel, because it's one thing to say, well, in smaller companies, not all of that knowledge is present, and that's a fact, and it's understandable quite often, right? We back things that are early in development, where some very smart people get together that may not have thought through all of this, but at the same time, we find it very important. So our way of dealing with that is to make some of that knowledge available to them. And that's the board that you were alluding to. You mentioned this example of when regulators and HTA started giving joint advice. Well, I think one of the earliest initiatives there was EMA and NICE, and it was Guido Razi heading the EMA and Carol Longson heading NICE, and both of us sit on our board. We have a couple of people who are it's a group of 9 at the moment, and these are people who represent the payer, the HTA side, from real life experience. None of them hold their functions anymore. They can speak quite freely, but the experience that they have and their perspectives that they bring to our companies are invaluable. They're invaluable to us as an investor as we make our assessments, but at least equally importantly for our portfolio companies, we make this available. Because we don't want to stop at saying, guys, it's important and solve it. No, if you're a hands-on investor and all you do is invest in this space, we want to take it to the next level. It is something that as I said in the very beginning, I find a very important topic. There's another thing on the investor side, which I'll share with the audience. I'm not sure if everybody knows it. On the public market side, there's such a thing as short the launch. This is a mantra with investors. What that means is shorting in very nutshell means that you're betting on the share price to go down, and the launch would be the launch of a product. So the investors, by and large, are assuming that when a company launches a product, a small company, I should say, it'll probably do badly. Now, that at some point hit me like, what the heck does that mean? What are we doing here, right? So if there's anything that we can do as investors to help our companies make their products relevant, develop them efficiently, develop it the way a couple of people have already said, with the end user in mind, with access in mind, what is really something people are willing to pay for? How do I get it in the hands of prescribers, or whoever the end user might be? That is our goal. So yeah, Mel, this is something that indeed I think we may be one of the early adopters for, but it's important. In my mind, prior discussion, the writing is on the wall with capital letters, including in the US. This is not just going to continue as was. And anyway, I don't mean to be arrogant saying that we have all the solutions, but at least we're trying to be creative with the companies with that.
Yeah, thank you. And then any sort of comment on how you see? I mean, maybe this is one more for Sahil. I know you've done some work of actually how do you incorporate market access considerations into the deal structure itself. Maybe you can comment on that. I don't know whether Hilary or Sandeep, you've also done any of that in terms of how the milestones and payments get made, but I think it's a sort of another evolution on this. So Sahil?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, honestly, it's never been easy, and it's still not easy to get people to accept the fact that you need to hit anything beyond regulatory approval to be successful. There is resistance, and despite everything, early biotech companies, to Job's point, do not necessarily have the knowledge base to do this. So you're sort of talking to an audience that needs a lot of education. I have in the past been able to ensure that there were milestones, CVR structures in place, which would be realized only when certain markets would open up, especially in Europe, which are pretty binary when it comes to market access, and that I would see as a clear win. I mean, the other piece which I think is important structurally is to ensure that you have a clear pre-agreed definition of what a differentiated profile looks like, and ensuring that those definitions are contractually baked in, so that there's no further negotiation that wiggles these plans out of what should be a strong profile and what you're truly investing in. So there's a lot to be done in terms of what a profile should look like in the future when you're investing, which includes market access endpoints.
So Hilary, Sandy, are you sort of are you mainly impacting on whether the deal is made, or the sort of construct of the deal forecast for that, in terms of price and volume? Are you also able to sort of influence how the deals are made in terms of their structure?
I'll let Hilary go first then.
Okay. I mean, it is absolutely critical to the deal model, the deal forecast. Ultimately, the attractiveness of any deal, the biggest single factor is, what do we think this is worth? What do we think is the size of the opportunity here? And as I said earlier, both the price that you think you can get and the extent to which you can get breadth of access in key markets is going to be absolutely essential to that. Now, you may be interested in then sort of navigating some risk in terms of what that looks like. But I think it's, and you could build that into a deal model, but I think it's a bit more sort of fundamental to just whether this is an interesting opportunity or not for us to pursue. Now, this could all sound pretty scary, because when you look at large pharma biotech companies, we might have very large departments of people in all these different countries devoted to market access. So how are you going to replicate that when you're a smaller organization, a startup, and you need to do things in a much more streamlined way? The thing that I would say is, it's not very many decisions that need to be made with market access or value and access in mind. You just need to find those key decisions, and finding the individuals internally or externally who can help you understand what those few critical decision points are that are going to really drive that valuation, and how you can somewhat adjust your approach to do that. And that may just be a handful of conversations, a very light process, but it's absolutely essential it happens.
Yeah.
I think just add on to that, I think this kind of talks about the understanding of the partner's commercial capability at the end of the day. And one of the key metrics for that commercial capability is your time to access. And even though it may not be in the deal structure or even in the term sheet specifying that KPI, But I think companies that have done reasonably well, I mean, if you look at some of the weight indicators that comes out from FPR work, that's a good benchmark already exists in the marketplace. So when partners are coming around to talk to biotech around the table, the other side, the IND or the NDA holders, they have already an understanding of what question to ask. It's like, how long did it take your last 5 products to gain reimbursement in country X, Y, and Z? And that is, commercial in confidence. You can definitely discuss that. It's not a direct KPI, sort of written in black and white in a deal structure or a model, but that's where the appreciation or sometimes lack thereof of the commercial capability in a particular region comes into play, in a very candid fashion. So I think that's definitely, one area. And I think the other aspect is the, as Hillary was saying on the US side, I think the more questions are being asked, and there are more analogs where, despite a hands down pivotal trial data, the contracts, PBMs or payer contract, have completely forced a new innovation out of contention from a commercial success standpoint. And I think that is definitely impacting a lot of the valuations, not just the at what price, but it's more about what's the gross to net across payer mix. Those are becoming much more critical, points of discussion, even though the actual language in the deal could be something more explicit and traditional.
So interesting. So Hillary just mentioned the sort of the potentially scary large market access departments you see in larger companies, and I know that Alan and Lamsand, you have you have good market access capabilities because you've already sort of got past that point of requiring them, bringing them in. But I was curious to know when we look at other small biotech companies, that don't have the access capabilities, and maybe I'll ask you first to give us sort of like a broad view of the companies that you're evaluating. How often do companies have any sort of real access capability, and if they don't have that access capability, who's taking care of it? And how do they sort of think about that? And then I guess another question I'd like to also address is what risks are those companies with those access gaps facing? We may have covered a bit of that already, but maybe if you can address that,
Yeah,
the risks in my mind are simple. They're huge. Now, how do you do it? It really depends on the type of company we look at, Mel. So we back companies in the medical device health tech space that are typically maybe already early commercial, or they're getting towards commercial. There is never an issue. At least the companies we speak to, they understand this is important. It may not be perfect yet. It may need to be expanded, but at least in terms of mindset and in terms of some dedicated people. And of course, when they're commercializing, there's a team. It's something that typically can be strengthened, but tends to be already there. It kind of pre-selects based on what we are interested in. Now, on the therapeutic side of things, we also back companies that are early clinical or late preclinical. Now, here's the difference. Now, what are we looking for? Still, we want our teams to think through, based on the target product profile, how could this fit? And of course, it's an evolving space. There's a lot of uncertainty there, but at least how does this really, it's the better care component, if you will, and better care, lower cost. And then on top of that, we want them to think about, so if this, so what that means is that differentiated products win the day any day, right? Particularly in the current payer environment. But then the cost implications, and the cost implications are multiple fold. Is there something that might no longer need to be used when this is introduced? Does it take out a costly procedure? Does it add complexity on the physician level? All these things. And typically what we find for the very early opportunities, Mel, it's not in place yet. Many companies don't have this in place. Now, what do we want them? We want them to be open to work, with some of the people we have in place. I mentioned a few, or with advisors. At some point, we want people to join who are dedicated to this, because again, timing here is essential. I'd like our companies to consider this at an early enough stage so they can still make modifications as they go and make this product relevant. So, but there's no one size fits all answer, Mel. But this is how we do it.
it comes back to the sort of start in mind philosophy that we would start with the end in mind philosophy that we sort of talked about a bit earlier. That's so key. Sandeep, can you?
Yeah.
And I'll come to Sahil.
Definitely. I think, irrespective of the size, if you look at the appointments of chief commercial officers in some of these biotechs, small or mid-size mostly, they have experienced access either directly managing the group at some point in the career, or have been burned by lack of access in some way. So it kind of stays in their radar, very prominently. And they are also aware how to scale up an access organization and at what point. So the appointment of those kind of, talents in the chief commercial officer role is becoming more and more critical. And if you look around, those are the kinds of, professionals are coming into the CCO roles with a stint in market access, or have been influenced by market access so much in their prior life based on their portfolio and or country management experience, that you almost get a 2-for-1 deal until you are able to, scale up or stage gate the market access function. And I'm saying that, and it's a good sign, for, even for the market access professionals, that they are not asked to deliver everything without appropriate capital allocation, for their function. So I think there's definitely a growing respect and importance, but at the same time, I think, making the function too big, too quick is something that it needs to be avoided, or like just throwing up the hands in the air. Oh, if you don't give me 3 directors and 2 senior directors, I cannot launch your first product 5 years from now.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of, you've got to be lean and fit for purpose, actually, don't you?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned this sort of CCO role. I mean, sometimes that CCO role is actually appointed sort of relatively downstream. I mean, you might have a CBO like Sahil, but often that CBO, I mean, Sahil's an exception here, might not have the access experience. They might be more of a deal maker. And so, maybe Sahil, can you sort of comment on that, and what you see in the companies that you've spoken to?
No, it's a fascinating point, I think, because I would say yes. In a classical biotech where the furthest molecule is in phase 1 or phase 2, with the current capital environment, I don't think investors would look at it very fondly if there's a CCO in place, because you are, thinking of a CCO too early. But having said that, I mean, I also believe the best outcome for access in the long term is if your CMO is astute on market access and they are thinking about what they need to have from an evidence perspective, and then have the right biomarkers and the surrogates in place. So, you've got something being developed for kidney disease, a CKD. Make sure that the biomarkers in place, which shows delay in ESRD early on, so that you are actually playing for that outcome. And then if you've got that person who's been in a place in an R&D team where the right inputs have been incorporated and they've seen success, that person's actually very well positioned to ensure that the right package is developed. And I think a company at this earlier stage of clinical development, I would argue, should be very focused on making sure that you bring in a clinical developer with the right mindset, with the right experience, having put drugs through a successful evidence package.
I see. I think that's so interesting, because I'm often approached by the CMO on access topics where they don't have another role in house. But it's also interesting that it's often clinical development where these issues are sort of hit first. And I remember one company approached me with an issue because one of their clinical KOLs had said, maybe you need this measure in the trial that you're running, which is a sort of phase 2, phase 3. And that's when they thought, oh, we need to think about access. And it was again the CMO. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. So we're coming up. I'd like to take some questions to the audience, but the last question is a really quick question here: is when do we think the market access work should start? And I think we'll see some variation in views here, depending whether, I know I've worked for large companies where it started much earlier, and then smaller companies, I know it's later. But I'd be curious to know when we think it should start, and maybe it is organisation dependent as well in terms of size. Maybe Hilary start, and then we'll.
Yeah. So I would divide market access into two things. One is the ability to have somebody who can understand how to factor access considerations into strategic decisions. And for me, that starts in discovery. That starts when you think about your corporate strategy. What are we here to do? You've got to have some lens on what is it someone's going to value at the end of the game. In terms of where do you then need a more intense focus, I think realistically that's it's a phase 2 to phase 3 piece in terms of really starting to think about endpoints, study design, comparators, PROs, and those factors that are going to add to your evidence base. So it's definitely a ramp up, but don't discount one individual understanding this early in your decision making.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I would say like, where your corporate focus is with respect to therapeutic area. Because ideally, I think, Hilary is correct, that phase 2 to phase 3 transition. But if you're in, oncology areas where your go-to market is phase 2, then you are looking at a discovery, even at the level of screening candidates based on some kind of access potential, or as we'd call it, access haircut in some way. I think that's where it comes into play, largely driven by, or if you're entering into a high volume specialty area where you have to find a niche population because you'll be going against generics and or biosimilars. So that's, I think, determines a lot of the time how early you want to invest in the market access, whether, for external investments and or actually having a head of market access sooner in the process.
Yeah. You?
Probably not surprising to you guys that I would say it's at the time of choice of indication. Because quite often we get people who are very passionate about a certain target, a certain disease, a certain approach. At that time, you need that passion balanced by a bit of a reality check on where the demand lies on the other side and how you tap into that demand. And choice of indication is one of those things. I'm not saying you would need a full-time person on board at that point in time, but you want that around the table. Now, if it can come from a CMO to a sales point, great. But we also have CMOs who we think are really good, but they don't bring that particular skill, and then you have to bring it in. And again, it can come from advisors, people like our board, but also just from people who do this. At the early phases, it's probably not yet immediately a full-time function, but you wanted it. A choice of indication, you wanted in. Quite a few mistakes, in my view, have been made by people who have not taken this, who just followed what they thought was the right thing to do. Follow the science, we often say. Now, you should follow science, but on top of that, have the reality check from what's really, how hard it is to get to the other side and how you want to get there.
Thank you. Sahil, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think all very good points, and I would almost, say yes, it's therapy area more than anything else. Agreeing with Sandeep. I mean, the one thing I would say is, I don't think a company, I would argue, even before it gets to phase 3, should have a dedicated market access person. It's about making sure that the leadership, and it could be, at this C-level or below, has the right experience and making sure that, investors add that pressure to ensure that these people are in place is going to be critical. Otherwise, ultimately companies at that stage, all they really are worried about is making sure there's money to run to the next stage. That's really it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's interesting that there's more commonality. I mean, it's sort of most of you agreeing that we should start early, but it's more about the type of capability. So it's much more of a corporate strategic type capability early on, and then obviously later on it becomes a bit more detail and a bit more sort of endpoints, etc., and sort of trial design focus. So I think that's really good to hear. I'd like to take some questions from the audience now. I've got one here from Xiong Peng from NIMH, who's a scientist in the US. She asked the question is, how do you anticipate the increasing scrutiny on pricing and reimbursement will shape future access strategies? So, I mean, we've talked about some of the evolutions that we're seeing, in the US market, but globally as well. So, what do we think will how will these shape future access strategies? Who would like to have a go at that one? Quite a big question.
Well, I'll take a stab. I think I think this discussion about how critical it is to bring the discussion earlier in the development cycle. I think that becomes more important. I think the other aspect is the kind of the second order impact of the IRA. To keep in mind. Yes, some products will be negotiated that as a heavy Medicare population. But where it is impacting development is screening of the assets that are going to face competitors in the marketplace that will go through the IRA or price negotiations. It's not just your own asset, in a niche population, but by the time even second year or third year after launch, if you're, the standard of care and or biggest competitor in your class is going to go through IRA negotiation, that needs to come through in the drug development decision and discussion process. I think that is also connected to the policy element, like what are the evolving policy that can impact your portfolio directly or indirectly. I think that's definitely on the internal side of the manufacturing or the manufacturer side. I think the external place, I think there are, at least post-COVID, there is more appreciation of pharmaceutical innovation than before. And especially, for someone coming from NIMH, I think can resonate probably with the, with how the vaccine was brought in. But it's a little bit of the shaping of the minds as well, especially that in the cell and gene therapy area that everyone is kind of going through right now in US, is that nobody's challenging the innovation coming, in that space. But everyone is wondering, okay, how do we pay? Because now every gene therapy is at least $1 million more than the previous one. And I think that's where, is the more of the discussions coming through, both from the private and the public payer standpoint. So a lot of the, how values really get manifested over time has completely changed. From what used to be the dominantly cardiovascular, franchises into cell and gene therapy, even in the oncology space. So I think that narrative and the discussion is already evolving, and we cannot just, stop that in shaping the policy discussion around that. Especially when every 4 years this becomes a very burning topic in US, and so we need to be equal partner in that discussion. But we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, thank you, Sandeep. Another question here. I'm sorry I haven't got the name of this, but how do you de-risk drug development with cash constraints? I think I'll throw this over to Sahil, please.
Oh yeah, I mean, see, ultimately that's a day-to-day question that every single biotech CEO needs to answer. How do I de-risk with as little cash as I could? I mean, relevant to this panel, I would say, how do you do that while having some sort of clarity on what access differentiation you could produce along the way? And for me, the simple answer is you really can't play around too much with primary endpoints and what you're trying to achieve with regulators and sort of flipping your risk card, but adding the right secondary endpoints at the right stage, making sure that you then eventually have the ability to add either a sort of additional small trial alongside the phase 3 or a further outcome there goes a very long way. And I think people underestimate how little it costs and how little risk you're adding by doing things such as, adding a simple, depending on what area you're in, adding a simple driving test, or sort of adding something of the sort, which just doesn't move the needle at that stage, but can mean everything for your label in the future.
Thank you, Sahil. So yeah, please do put your names on the question rather than anonymous, so I can give you a shout out. I've got a question here from Sheila Reddy. I can't see the organisation, but with adaptive trial design being considered more and more, surely access should be considered even as early as phase 1 in these cases, as you could go directly to phase 2, phase 3. I actually think we've sort of addressed some of that because we've all said we should go early, but maybe does someone want to sort of comment on that?
Is that I don't think our payers have moved at the same speed as our regulators in what they will accept when they think about more novel approaches. Actually, the biggest blocker there is that if you do have an adaptive, if you're launching with imperfect evidence for very good reasons in terms of how your product was developed, you will face penalties unless we can together advocate for some system change on that. I feel rather strongly on that, having developed a drug in the middle of COVID and seen that, our HTA processes really are not adapted for anything out of the ordinary. And I don't think that serves patients so well as it should.
Thank you, Hilary. I'm actually going to go to a question that we actually had in the as people signed up for this. It was an interesting question from Hannah Kurth from Pulse Edge. She asked, what scenarios do investors typically want to see regarding market access estimates impacting valuations? And so maybe I could ask you to cover this one.
Yeah, I think what do we want to see? Again, it's very case by case dependent, but we want to see people have thought this through carefully, and we realize there's quite a bit of uncertainty there, particularly if you're quite far away from your launch. A lot of things may happen, competitive-wise, IRA-wise. A lot of things could change, but at least think through how your product might indeed be better than the SOC standard of care at the point in time in launch, as hard as that is, and as much as uncertain as that is, and then use that again to inform what will be your go-to-market strategy in the different jurisdictions. Now, that's a big ask, particularly for smaller companies. But again, it's working your way back that way. That's what we're looking for. Do we run scenarios? Of course we do. There's too much uncertainty to really pinpoint into a certain scenario. At the end of the day, we're educated risk takers. At least we like to believe we are. So we will take risk. The one risk we don't take is people who, what's the word in English? The ostrich, right? The one that sticks their head in the sand. That's kind of what we don't want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I know we've only got a couple of minutes. I've got a hand back. I'm not going to be able to address any of the other questions, but please do continue to send them in, and they will be addressed after the call. I just wanted to do a quick, final sort of closing round, if you like, based on the sort of topic that we've covered today. What would be your real, your one sort of most important recommendation for small biotech when they're sort of thinking about this topic? And maybe we start with Hilary and then sort of go around from there, clockwise.
Okay, don't underestimate how little resource you need to answer some of those questions in the early stage. It doesn't even need to be a full-time market access head. But don't underestimate how much resource it takes when you actually come to launch the product, if you choose to launch it yourself, to get through those actual market access barriers in the markets.
Thank you.
I'll say, increase your capability in relevant areas, because you do not have a big organization. You will be asked to wear a lot of hats while you're providing access-related recommendation. So try to understand where your CMO or CEO or CSO, where are they coming from? Try to learn how to convince them using their language and not yours.
I like it. Thank you. You, and then Sahil?
Very briefly, if you're a small biotech company, don't feel ashamed that you don't have all this knowledge. Just get it. And to Hilary's point, I fully agree with that. It might still be a relatively easy fix, so at least think this through now. It's going to be a major lift to repair it if you haven't done it well. So I fully agree with that.
Thanks. And don't be an ostrich. Sahil?
No, I'd start with that. Don't be an ostrich again. But definitely, I would say just make sure you're thinking beyond the next step. I think that's what this really is about, because everyone knows it's needed. It's just not wanting to think. So make sure you think beyond the next step at the right level, and not miss that.
Yeah, I think that came out loud and clear. Start with the end in mind. I think that's so important. It's not a sequential process. You have to think about it all up front. Well, I think that's it for today. I want to say a huge thank you to the panelists. I've actually taken a lot away from this personally, so thank you very much for that, and I know the audience will have done. Thank you very much to the audience for all the questions. These will get answered as follow-up. And thanks again to FingerPost and to Scientist.com for co-sponsoring this. I think we're on time. I'm just going to hand back to Matt to close. And thank you very much.
Hi, everyone again. Yeah, thank you, Mel. I just also want to give my heartfelt thanks to the panelists today for some really engaging discussion, and certainly to Mel for his expert moderation. So in closing, we hope that you enjoyed this Scientist.com webinar produced in partnership with FingerPost, and enjoy the rest of your day.